1863 New Zealand Settlements Act. Parliament passed the Suppression of Rebellion Act, which allowed for the introduction of martial law, and the New Zealand Settlements Act, which authorized the taking of land from Maori. The intention of the act was to punish rebel Maori by allowing the confiscation of their lands. However, the act's title disguised this by portraying it as a measure to assist European settlement, particularly by placing military settlers on lands as a type of buffer between Maori and European settlements. Maori considered to be in rebellion were not entitled to compensation, and even loyal Maori were first offered monetary compensation, rather than the return of their land. Later, the law was amended to allow awards of land, including small areas, to surrendered rebels. 1863-65 War in Waikato, Bay of Plenty and East Coast. The war dominated this period. Fighting flared up again in Taranaki in May 1863. In July 1863, Governor Grey ordered Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron to cross the Mangatwiri River, the accepted boundary to the Waikato, with his mixed imperial and colonial army. His stated justification for this action was a belief that the Kinjitanga was the fount of Maori resistance to British authority, and his fear of an attack on Auckland. The Waikato campaign lasted until the Maori defeat at the Battle of Orcau in April 1864. The fighting then spread immediately to Tauranga, with the Maori victory at Gate P, and their defeat at Tiranga, where East Coast Maori, trying to help, were driven off by government forces. Historians have much debated the causes of the wars. Some suggest that the wars can be seen as an attempt by the British to impose real as opposed to nominal sovereignty over Maori. More specific factors such as a hunger for land, or the desire to impose British administration, law, and civilization on Maori, can be seen as aspects of this overarching cause. Other historians argue that land was the critical factor that led to the outbreak of war. 1864 Colonial self-reliance. As the imperial government was losing enthusiasm for paying for the thousands of men fighting in New Zealand, the Weld Ministry pushed a policy of colonial self-reliance in dealing with Maori, so that the settlers could handle matters as they saw fit. Despite many reservations about this, the point was largely conceded by the imperial authorities, and in a rapid series of steps in 1864-65, the governor lost the power to control Maori affairs. Grey managed to retain some imperial troops for several years, but after mid-1865 they were restricted to garrison duties. 1864 Land confiscations. The first proclamation confiscating land under the New Zealand Settlements Act was made in December 1864. In all, 5 districts were proclaimed to be under the Act over the next 3 years: Taranaki, Waikato, Tauranga, Eastern Bay of Plenty, and M6 Haka-Waker. The area affected was about 1.5 million acres. A compensation court, mostly comprising judges of the Native Land Court, was set up to hear claims by loyal Maori for monetary compensation, or to recover their land. 1865 Native Land Court established. Following the Native Land Act 1865, a new Europeanized Native Land Court replaced the court established under the 1862 Act. In determining ownership, the court was required to name no more than 10 owners, regardless of block size, thus effectively dispossessing all other tribal members who may have been owners. The newly designated owners held their lands individually, not communally as part of, or as trustees for, a tribal group, and could deal with it, including selling it, as individuals and for their own benefit. Many then did that, either willingly or as prospective purchasers picked them off one by one, often by getting them into a debt that could be paid off only by selling land. 1865 to 1867 Legislation to secure peace. In 1865, the Kinjitanga leaders effected a ceasefire in the Waikato, and the British government announced that it would begin to withdraw its forces from New Zealand. In an effort to try to secure peace, successive settler governments passed laws that were intended to give practical effect to some of the promises implied in the treaty. These included Bullet the Native Rights Act 1865, which gave Maori the rights of natural-born British subjects, and allowed them to sue, and be sued in the Supreme Court. Bullet the Maori Representation Act 1867, which created the 4 Maori seats based on adult, male, voting. Bullet the Native Schools Act 1867, which provided funds for schools in Maori villages teaching in English, and many Maori communities were to embrace the program eagerly in the 1870s and gift land for schools. And bullet the Resident Magistrates Act 1867, which continued the system of salaried Maori assessors and police, and allowed some bicultural application of law in rural areas, a system that was wound down in the 1880s, and abolished in 1893. But the government persisted with the land confiscations, or forced cessions, which gave rise to resistance by Te Kuti and Te Takaueru. 1865 Te Kuti imprisoned without trial until 1865. The government tended to treat Maori who were captured in battle as prisoners of war. In 1865, with the rise of the Palmyra movement, it also arrested people whom it thought were aiding the rebels. Te Kuti of Poverty Bay was one of these. He was sent with some 300 others to the Chatham Islands. Te Kuti's pleas for a trial were ignored. On 4 July 1868, Te Kuti and many followers escaped from the Chathams, and were pursued on the east coast, and in the Uruera and the Taup 6 districts. He founded the Ringat0 Church, and provided it with rituals and structures that last to this day. From 1868, the government began to charge particular individuals with crimes such as murder or treason, but Te Kuti escaped the pursuing forces, over some 4 years, and was eventually pardoned in 1883. 1868 Te Takaueru resists land confiscation. In 1868, Ngairuanui leader Te Takaueru led a strong resistance to land confiscation in South Taranaki. His force, persuading and coercing neighboring tribes to join in, swept south from the Huera district, inflicting several heavy defeats on the colonial forces and finally threatening Wanganui itself. In November, for some reason now unclear, Te Takaueru's army then largely deserted him, literally overnight, and he became a fugitive, hunted back into the inaccessible Upper Watara area. He was later involved in the Paruhaka passive resistance movement. 1868 First Maori Members of Parliament following the Maori Representation Act 1867, and while Te Takaueru and Te Kuti still led violent resistance, the first 4 Maori members were elected to Parliament. Under this statute, adult Maori men were given universal suffrage, voting rights, 11 years before Pakeha men, who still faced property qualifications. However, there were only 4 Maori seats at a time, when Maori should have had many more based on their population. Only in the 1890s did Maori begin to achieve significant influence in Parliament, first through James Carroll, member for Eastern Maori and then Gisborne, then through younger activists such as Aparanagata, Honhik Gapua, Peter Buck and Mal Palmer. The number of Maori seats remained constant at 4 until the first MMP election in 1996. Since then they have increased by 1 seat per election, reflecting the increasing numbers of voters on the Maori roll.